Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, for the opportunity to contribute to this debate. And as I rise to join the debate, I must admit that my emotions have run a gamut from disappointment to despair. And Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, it was a bit difficult to listen to the member, Secretary Pollard, because instead of articulating the vision of his division to build homes and provide houses to the people of Tobago, the member took quite a long time minding the business of the People's National Movement, minding the business of the central government, minding everybody else's business instead of his business. So I was a bit disappointed. And the simple fact of the matter is that, Madam Presiding Officer, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, my apologies, the minority leader went to great pains to explain the condition in which the economy was, which is in a growth state prior to this administration taking office, and what they have since done. And the simple fact of the matter is that this administration...
Member, could you pause to allow the presiding officer to take the chair?
Members be seated. Member, continue.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. And as I was saying, the simple fact of the matter is that this administration inherited an economy that was on the upswing after COVID, and the minority would have explained an economy with growth of 4.2%. And from day one, they have, with reckless and gay abandon, been emasculating the Tobago economy. We are in successive declines, Madam Economy, and today the economy is much weaker than it was in 2021. And as I evaluate the performance of this administration, I will begin by reflecting on the Chief Secretary's approach to this year's budget and the impact of some of his disastrous actions on the people of Tobago. 2.5 years and approximately $7 billion in allocation. What do we have to show for that, Madam Presiding Officer? Destruction of the quarry. Now we're seeing trucks lined up waiting. Something that has been in the past has now come back to haunt us. Destruction of the quarry. Destruction of the construction sector. Destruction of the agricultural sector. If we look at TATCO, destruction of TATCO, we have farmers protesting in front of the TATCO organization. Destruction of the tourism and cultural art form in Tobago, and there's only destruction taking place, Madam Presiding Officer. And as we speak to tourism and the cultural art form, I want to take a look into the tourism sector. And Madam Presiding Officer, as I listen to the now former Secretary of Finance, Trade and the Economy, who spoke about his administration's vision for tourism and the orange sector in Tobago, I was extremely baffled and disappointed. And I know many Tobagonians would also echo similar sentiments, that there is no vision for the tourism sector in Tobago. Can you imagine, Madam Presiding Officer, that this administration, after 2.5 years, cannot even produce, Madam Presiding Officer, more than 2 pages of plans for the tourism sector, Madam Presiding Officer? Where is the roadmap? Where is the framework? Nothing, Madam Presiding Officer. And the strategic plan that was promised very early in the Secretary's term, Madam Presiding Officer, and again early in the Secretary's term, and I will get to that point in great detail, the Secretary spoke about bringing 100,000 tourists. We have yet to see that, Madam Presiding Officer. Madam Presiding Officer, the Secretary would have spoken in some detail about the tourist arrivals. And the Secretary boasts about, in particular, Tobago cruise passenger arrivals. And Madam Presiding Officer, yes, I agree that there was some growth in that area. Madam Presiding Officer, what the Secretary failed to point out to the people of Tobago is that if you are moving from 0 to 1, the percentage increase obviously is 100. And Madam Presiding Officer, if we are coming from a close in the sector coming out of COVID, there were no arrivals in 2001, and we started to reopen in 2002. So the cruise ship arrivals, which is normally from November to April, in 2022, Madam Presiding Officer, in January, there were no arrivals. In February, there were no arrivals because the borders were closed. In March, there were no arrivals. In April, there are no arrivals. So if you are comparing, Madam Presiding Officer, so the total November is where we started to see arrivals coming to the destination, and December. So in a period where out of 6 months, you had 4 months with no cruise ship because we were now reopening and the place was closed. Madam Presiding Officer, how you could come here and claim over 100 and without sharing the real data with the people? If you are moving from 0 to any number, the percentage increases obviously 100% and more. And Madam Presiding Officer, what I would have liked is for the Secretary to really come and provide the data and the information. And the base period that the Secretary should really be looking at is 2019, pre-COVID arrivals. And if you want to compare and speak to the fact of improvement, Madam Presiding Officer, then the base...
Councilor Benoit, she's standing on a point of order. Please give way. Yes, Councilor Boris.
Madam Presiding Officer, I'd like to take the opportunity to correct the rule that the
Not on a point of order, Councilor, on a point of clarification.
clarification. Sorry, I would like to correct the information that the Councilor is explaining at this point. I did indicate in the statistics that I provided the 2019 season, which is 18 to 19 arrivals for cruise ship. I also indicated seasons 22 into 23 and 23 into this year. Yes?
Continue, Councilor.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. Madam Presiding Officer, the Secretary boasted about increases 2022 to 2023 of over 100 and something. And I am pointing out that in January, there were no cruise ship arrivals here. So if you move from 0 to 13,000 2023, then obviously it will be greater than 100%. And that's the point I am making, Madam Presiding Officer.
Continue.
So, Madam Presiding Officer, all I'm saying is be upfront with the people about the information and share the entire information. Madam Presiding Officer, and yes, we are happy to report increased tourist arrivals in relation to cruise ships to our destination. But, Madam Presiding Officer, What I also want to look at is an article, a Guardian article dated the 20th of April 2024. And the arrivals, I am hoping that sometime in the near future, our efforts could rebound to increase spending by those persons who would have visited our shores via the cruise ship. And Madam Presiding Officer, the article quotes the Tourism Trinidad visitor surveys, and the average visitor spend that was estimated, and this is for the period 2023-2024, was US $431 per person, equating to US $3,356,193. And this is equivalent to TT over $22 million. According to the survey conducted by a local agency, the average spend on tours per person was a further US $25. So with 21,094 persons disembarking from organized tours, this equated to $526,225 US and over 3.578 million TT dollars. The article goes on, as it pertains to Tobago, the Tobago Tourism Agency estimated spend per passenger was $26 US per person, totaling US $2.58 million, and converted into TT, 17.596 million for the season. So, Madam Presiding Officer, what we would like to see from all the initiatives over time of the Tobago Tourism Agency and the tourism sector is that if we could at least marginally increase, because that is the real benefit to the island of Tobago. When visitors come and they spend, we receive that benefit. So if all that is being done could increase the visitor spend, and it could be marginally when compared to Tobago, when compared to Trinidad, sorry, Madam Presiding Officer. So if we go back to 2017, sorry, Madam Presiding Officer, and even before that, when the PNM administration was in office, there was a clear vision for the tourism sector. And it was evident with the alignment of culture with tourism. And it was also clear that the product offering of the island needed to be clearly defined. And culture was being used as a vehicle to aid in boosting visitor traffic and interest to the destination. The establishment of the Tobago Tourism Agency was to position Tobago in a particular way when compared to our Caribbean neighbors, which is why we branded ourselves as untouched, unspoilt, and undiscovered Tobago beyond ordinary. Madam Presiding Officer, these fundamental and important changes ensure that Tobago was well featured in our key source markets, which resulted in the beautiful island winning numerous international tourism awards, some of which this administration has been celebrating today, arising out of that vision. Pre-COVID, it was evident that growth was in the sector. We saw Sunwing providing direct airlift from Canada. There was Virgin Atlantic, Condor, and British Airways out of the European market. And this was as a result of strategic visioning. Madam Presiding Officer, the people of Tobago must take note that this administration has invested millions in overseas travel, which may account to the only investment this island has seen, unfortunately paid by the taxpayer, under the disguise of marketing Tobago or seeking out investors for the island. To date, in this budget presentation, there is not one tourism or cultural investment that this administration can really meaningfully speak or boast about. Madam Presiding Officer, the Secretary spoke about investment in soca artists, but Madam Presiding Officer, this is something that would have occurred in the past under the PNM administration. There were soca competitions, competition for February Carnival, competitions for heritage. So Madam Presiding Officer, this is nothing new. It is very clear that this administration, from the onset, understood the value of pairing culture with tourism, and as such, the division remained tourism and culture, and they appreciated the PNM's vision for the sector. However, as much as they embraced it, they have single-handedly destroyed by leaving our cultural festivities in shambles. Our cultural festivals, Madam Presiding Officer, is currently in shambles. The budget presentation spoke to this administration focusing, and I quote, improvement of tourism infrastructure, product enhancement, airlift and human resource development, and research capacity. So in one breath, they are focusing on human resource development, but the established supporting companies such as the Tobago Tourism Agency, TPAC, and the Tobago Festivals Commission, the core companies that drive the sector, are absent from leadership and direction. And most of the companies, and I say that in the context that most of the companies are without a substantive CEO, Madam Presiding Officer. In some instances, some of them may be without boards. And I would have seen today, Madam Presiding Officer, that a release came from the division where a new board was appointed to the tourism Petal, Tobago Tourism Agency, and we wish them all the best. So, Madam Presiding Officer, with the absence of substantive CEOs and leadership, it is clear that we're not serious about the plans to develop the sector when our basic human resource capabilities are being dismantled. Madam Presiding Officer, we have seen an exodus, a high attrition of staff turnover within the organizations under the tourism, Tobago, the tourism division. Madam Presiding Officer, if we look at the festivals, what have they done? It appears as if they have systematically and deliberately attempted to destroy the National Carnival in February. Madam Presiding Officer, the once renowned jazz festival, after being rebranded by this administration, the return in 2023 has not returned in 2024. The Tobago Heritage Festival, one of the island's highly anticipated cultural festivals on the calendar, which is in its 37th edition, a festival that has been around for over 3 decades, is currently in ICU holding on for its dear life. It is noteworthy to mention that the villages that drew the largest crowds to the event, like the Salaka Feast in the cultural village of Pembroke and Lekito, folktales and superstitions would have had visitors coming from overseas, and our neighboring Trinidad has been wiped off the heritage calendar for 2024. And Madam Presiding Officer, I don't know what the reasons were for these villages not participating, but it is quite disappointing. And I don't know if it's because members from the Pembroke folk performers may have a song for not receiving payment timely. Madam Presiding Officer, I don't know what was the reason, but it's very disappointing not to see these signature villages appearing on the 2024 Heritage Calendar. So, Madam Presiding Officer, the budget statement spoke a lot of nothing, inclusive of continuing the strategy to attract airlift to the destination. And the question is, what has been the strategy over the last 2.5 years? As a matter of fact, Virgin was lost with no replacement to date. The arrival numbers have only increased marginally. The euphoria of the PDP within the election, Madam Presiding Officer, I spoke to that earlier, where we are still awaiting the over 100,000 plus arrivals from the Secretary of Finance, the Secretary of Tourism that she promised. And Madam Presiding Officer, the Secretary of Finance in his statement spoke about airlifts coming, and he would have mentioned as soon as July. I don't know if it's July this year or July next year. But the Secretary in her presentation spoke at the end of the calendar year. Madam Presiding Officer, we welcome new airlift to the destination, but we do hope that the necessary approvals are in train or have been received to ensure that the airlift comes to the nation, to Tobago. And Madam Presiding Officer, we didn't hear anything. We will be having a new airport. There's the airport expansion, and not one word as to how the policy of this administration in relation to tourism, what policy is put in place to capitalize on the airport expansion when it is opened. And we were hoping, Madam Presiding Officer, that we would hear a little bit more about the plans in that regard. So, Madam Presiding Officer, it is clear that there's a lack of foresight and inability to rebuild the tourism sector. If we looked at our Caribbean islands in St. Vincent, Grenada, Barbados, their tourism sectors are on the rebound. And Madam Presiding Officer, we are hoping that they could settle down and put some plans in place, and we eagerly await the strategic plan that was promised 2.5 years ago in relation to the rebuilding of the tourism sector. Madam Presiding Officer, I want to turn my attention to housing. And in 2023, the Chief Secretary would have outlined, and as he called it, an ambitious housing program to provide 1,000 fully serviced housing lots in the first term, which was 250 units per fiscal year. In the budget statement of 2024, another unrealistic housing program of more than 500 housing units and 800 service lots were mentioned. The Secretary for Settlements was even mandated in that statement to supply 20 low-cost housing units before the end of fiscal 2023. There are no reports in the statement, there are no reports from the Secretary about the completion of those 20 homes. Yet, in this statement, Madam Presiding Officer, the proposal is to start the construction of 54 housing solutions in Riseland Development, 447 housing units at Shervan and 140 housing units at Adventure. This bringing the total number of houses in the 2025 budget statement to 641 houses. Madam Presiding Officer, due to this administration's inability to deliver on its promised housing mandate, they have changed their language. So in the first two budgets, they spoke about completing houses and completing homes. But the wording in this statement has shifted to start or commence. So we're no longer able to complete. So we moved the language to start. So just imagine the secretary also promised to build, and this is the Secretary of Settlements, promised to build a house, one singular, uno, in Bremen in 20 days. Madam Presiding Officer, we are still awaiting the report on that. I think 20 days has come and gone several times, months now. Madam Presiding Officer, he boasts about traveling to Jamaica and St. Vincent and meeting with prime ministers and presidents. But Madam Presiding Officer, the houses that were promised still remain unfinished and undelivered. And that is delivery.
Member, you have 3 minutes of speaking time.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. Madam Presiding Officer, I recognize that this is the third consecutive budget that the member, the Chief Secretary, former Secretary of Finance, would have read, and he did not report to the people on the expenditure for the previous years. How did he spend? So we're calling for more money, more money, more money. But report to the people of Tobago how you spent the money. So, Madam Presiding Officer, I just want to share with you in 2023, and this is being quoted from the statements laid in the House. So as at August 2023, the sum of 1.8 billion rounded was received for recurrent, and 366 million was received for development program under the central government. Madam Presiding Officer, in Tobago, we would have collected, as at the end of August 2023, $185 million on behalf of the Consolidated Fund, bringing total receipts at the end of August 2023 to $2.002 billion. Madam Presiding Officer, there are a number of items of expenditure for that fiscal 23 that stood out, but because of time, I want to point out one in particular. Madam Presiding Officer, if you look at the rent and lease vehicles and equipment, in 2021, that expenditure was $13 million. In 2022, it increased by $5 million to 18.81. And by 2023, that figure for rent and lease on vehicles and equipment ballooned to $39.346 billion, Madam President, dollars. And the Division of Infrastructure, it must be noted that the Division of Infrastructure would have accounted for the majority of the expenditure under rent and lease. So in 2021, under the Division of Infrastructure, rent and lease was 10.1 million. In 2022, it was 12.2 million. And Madam Presiding Officer, in 2023, it was a whopping $35.495 million. And Madam Presiding Officer,
Member,
thank you. I will wrap up, and I hope that the member, the Chief Secretary, in his wrap-up, could tell us why the rent and lease and all the other things would have ballooned, Madam Presiding Officer.
Thank you.